This brand new international airport has been sitting completely empty for almost a decade. A ghost train runs once a day from the nearby city to keep the air moving. Its hotel has a skeleton staff dusting empty rooms and turning on taps to keep the water from going stagnant. Its luggage carousels rotate daily with no suitcases in sight, just to stop them from seizing up. And the boards that should be displaying departing and arriving flights have to be replaced. They've already worn out, without showing information for a single flight. It's 2019, and this is Europe's most disastrous and controversial airport. Welcome to Brandenburg, Berlin, the airport that took 3 decades to build. I'm sitting here in the terminal of one of Europe's most controversial airports. In development since the early 90s, it took 14 years to construct with a final price tag that soared to over €7 billion. This is Brandenburg Airport. The airport has now been open for 5 years and is a thriving piece of aviation infrastructure. You could walk off a plane through any terminal here and have no idea of the turmoil of its construction or of the ghost airport it was just a few years ago. But the story behind it is far from simple. First conceived when the wall came down in 1989, the airport was supposed to be a symbol of a newly unified Berlin. Instead, it became a symbol of modern Germany's over-bureaucratization and complete mismanagement. More than 500,000 faults were found back when it was supposed to be opened in 2012, including a fire safety system that didn't work and more than 170,000 kilometers of cable that had to be reinstalled. What's often forgotten, however, is that this disaster started out with an incredibly admirable goal. Firstly, you have to understand the power of the airplane as both a remarkable piece of engineering and as a symbol. For East Berliners, the idea of flying west or around the globe was nothing more than a fantasy until news footage of the wall coming down. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, the country had new problems to face, namely a population that had just doubled. The wall came down in 1989, and suddenly Berlin's population doubled. What was once 2 cities became 1. This meant merging 2 disparate economies, 2 vastly different infrastructures, 2 governments, and 2 cultures. Many East Berliners lost their jobs, while many West Berliners viewed their counterparts as economic burdens. There was massive social division. The new unified Berlin wanted to become a hub for international travel, but its 3 airports were outdated and not able to handle the scale of the city that Berlin had become. The idea was to replace all 3 of those existing airports with a new single hub. Berlin now also had 3 airports, although none of them could accommodate this new unified Berlin. There were 2 for the former West Berlin here at Tegel and Tempelhof and 1 for the east at Schönefeld. Running all of these smaller outdated airports was inefficient. So it was decided a new world-class international airport would be built, comparable to those in Frankfurt and Munich. It would announce Berlin as a new power in Europe and as Germany's new capital. Perhaps most importantly, it would symbolize the unification of the country. Berlin needed to be bound together, and this airport would do it. €7 billion is no small amount of money. The accountants keeping tabs on costs would have had to be razor sharp. Even if your budget is a touch smaller than several billion, working with numbers can make the strongest of stomachs queasy. For now, let's jump back to 1996. The first sign that things would not go so smoothly for Brandenburg Airport, it took 6 years for them to decide on a site. And, after all that time, they ended up choosing here, right next to the existing Schönefeld Airport. Map. Further delays meant that construction didn't start until 2006, just in time for the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. The global economic downturn made it very difficult to find a contractor to build and fund the airport, so they used public money. According to Martin Delius, a former Berlin city politician, those in charge decided to break the airport into lots of smaller contracts with different companies and people in charge of those sections. They did this in an attempt to get lower prices, but what they ended up creating was a vastly complicated system with many heads that was difficult to oversee. Meinhard von Gerken was brought on to be the chief architect. He had designed Berlin landmarks like the Central Railway Station and already had 1 airport under his belt, Tegel Airport. He would essentially be replacing himself. Conflicts between von Gerken and the politicians in charge came about almost immediately. the details of which were handily published later in von Jerken's Tell-All book, in which he blamed everybody else for the airport's delays. Von Jerken hated shops. He hated how airports were becoming giant malls. He hated, and this is a quote, passengers in his airport, dragging around unwanted bottles of whiskey like a beggar. So he designed his airport to have as few shops as possible. When the airport company eventually realized this, they insisted on adding new floors purely for shopping. After all, they expected to make up to 50% of their revenue from retail. It's safe to say, von Jerken wasn't pleased. But a lack of duty-free shopping was hardly the only challenge. Berlin's then Mayor Klaus Wauert insisted that departure gates accommodate giant Airbus A380 aircraft that were no longer in production by the time the airport opened. They also didn't have any gates designed for the low-cost flight revolution that was suddenly taking over Europe. This again necessitated a last-minute redesign, as they only had the much more expensive jet bridges. These constant design changes led to unrealistic deadlines. There was too much to do, and what needed to be done kept getting changed at the last minute. All the while, the 2012 grand opening loomed. They had already pushed the date back a year, invitations had been sent out, and the press was waiting. They could not delay again. So these issues were ignored. Until, a few weeks before the grand opening, an inspector found the airport's entire fire safety system to be completely faulty. There was officially no way the airport could function, and the opening was cancelled, embarrassing Berlin and Germany as a whole. Further investigations revealed major structural and technical problems, including more than 120,000 defects, one of which was more than 170,000 kilometers of incorrectly installed cable. All at once, the astonishing scale of the new airport's problems became horribly public. Meinhard von Jerken was fired, and following his departure, Hartmut Medorn was brought in to manage the construction of the airport. As the former CEO of Germany's biggest railway company, Medorn promised to finally deliver this project. He carried out his own investigation into the airport. If you thought 120,000 defects was bad, Medorn found an astonishing 550,000 faults. The budget ballooned from €2 billion to over €7 billion. It was at this point that many called for the whole thing to be called off and to start again from scratch. But the plane had well and truly left the gate. Far too much money had already been spent for the project to be simply abandoned. The years rolled by, and more target dates were missed. The airport didn't open in 2013, 2014, 2017. Which brings us back to 2019, where the airport sat unused and empty, waiting for planes that, it seemed, would never land. We all know what happened to the aviation industry in 2020. The pandemic was a once-in-a-lifetime event. International travel was banned pretty much overnight. This was the absolute worst possible time to open an airport. Well, actually, it wasn't. After nearly a decade of delays, Berlin-Brandenburg Airport finally opened on Halloween, October 31, 2020. Unfortunately, the airport's capacity was already insufficient for the number of passengers that were expected to use it. In an ordinary year, this would be a disaster. But thanks to the pandemic and the far fewer passengers Berlin was receiving, for once, Brandenburg Airport had ample time to adjust and avoid major operational chaos. Technical glitches were fixed quietly, and mass public scrutiny was avoided. By the time travel rebounded in 2022 and 2023, Brandenburg had worked through most of its opening phase issues. The Berlin Wall stood for 3 decades. That's also how long it took for this airport to finally open. While the airport continues to have its challenges, post-COVID, its operation has been relatively smooth. The story of its construction is a reminder that major infrastructure projects are often built for future generations and not for the ones building them. The airport is now thriving. It recently won the Airport Innovation Award in 2023, beating out rivals Vienna, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam, and an audit by Skytrax awarded it 4 stars just this year for its efficiency and service quality. On top of that, it is now one of the first airports in the world to use AI in its operations to analyze aircraft handling in real time. Brandenburg Airport has finally arrived, and it's fulfilling its promise of a united Berlin on the cutting edge. While its symbolic power may be tarnished, Brandenburg Airport was eventually built. It will now be enjoyed by generations who never saw the wall intact, living in the fully unified city their parents dreamed of. It may have taken a little longer to get there, but Berlin's newest airport has officially taken flight. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed this video and you want to get more from the Definitive Video channel for construction, make sure you're subscribed.